I got these little 24-page pamphlets from New Growth Press today, and I thought maybe I would read one aloud. This one's by Victor Veith, What the Bible Says About Abuse Survivors and Those Who Hurt Them. Printed in India. Oh, I thought I could get a copyright date somewhere here. 2017. With Victor Veith and G.R.A.C.E. Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Pastors and church personnel often struggle to apply the intentional and appropriate doses of both biblical grace and stringent accountability to victims and perpetrators of child sexual abuse. Partly as a result of ignorance, Christians often apply a heavy dosage of law or conviction to victims, and grace, gospel-centered grace, toward offenders. This misguided, sometimes cruel use of theological principles often drives victims away from a church and from their personal walk with God, emboldening offenders to remain in their sin and even to commit such an offense again. This book encourages a deeper understanding of both abuser and victim dynamics, so that church leaders can move past ignorance and myth and tackle this devastating issue with the power of grace and truth afforded by the good news of Jesus. Here, we will consider the proper biblical response to each party, as well as offering practical suggestions to assist the church in responding to both. I'm not sure if I feel like I can keep reading. I wanted to know about the author, so I stopped. Oh, here's a author profile. Victor Veith is a former child abuse prosecutor. Oh, he is an attorney. Formerly was. He went on to direct the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse, which is a program of the National District Attorneys Association. He worked with the NDAA and Winona State University, creating the National Child Protection Training Center. This is now a program of the Gunderson Health System. He's published dozens of peer-reviewed works on child abuse and has received numerous awards and honors for his work. He serves on the board of directors of the Academy on Violence and Abuse, called AVA, and on Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, and on the advisory board to male survivors through Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. He serves on a national committee to develop a model seminary course covering child sexual abuse. And then in the description of the book above his profile, it says, Victor Veith will offer a deeper understanding of both abuser and victim dynamics so that church leaders might move past ignorance and the prevailing myths to tackle this devastating issue with the power of godly grace and godly truth afforded by the good news of Jesus Christ. Victor explains typical dynamics of how and when child sexual abuse might be reported. He gives an overview of the dynamics of child molesters and describes healing ways to represent Jesus to survivors. This timely resource will equip churches to wisely and accurately step in to take care of its most vulnerable members. All right, back to page 3 at the beginning of the book. An overview of the dynamics of child sexual abuse. In order to spiritually counsel or assist sexually abused children in any way, churches need to understand the dynamics of abuse. Unfortunately, many have accepted decades-old myths about child sexual abuse victims, including the most harmful and prevalent, and that is that children's allegations of abuse are inherently suspect. This skepticism toward claims of sexual abuse has led the churches to focus heavily and almost exclusively on any problematic behaviors exhibited by the child. Those behaviors that, ironically, may be attributable to the abuse. There is no excuse for the body of Christ to apply such a distorted view of blame and culpability to child abuse victims. The historic skepticism toward victims of child sexual abuse. Heading. This is a quote. It's quote number 3. Let me see who it's from. By Mary Pride, The Child Abuse Industry, Outrageous Facts About Child Abuse. Wheaton, Illinois. Publisher Crossway, 1986. Okay, I quote, "The history of psychology in the past 100 years has been filled with theories that deny sexual abuse occurs. They discount the responsibility of the offender. They blame the mother and child when it does occur. And that minimize the impact. This damaging trend, coupled with high-profile daycare cases from 1980s, in which many believed those children were coached into false allegations, spilled over into our mainstream culture, including the churches. For example, one Christian publisher printed a book. Oh, this is Mary's claim now. I'm sorry. Dear. One Christian publisher printed a book claiming there was an industry of child protection professionals manufacturing allegations of abuse in order to snatch children away from their parents. Although we all need to be mindful of the possibility of false allegations, multiple studies conclude that these instances are rare. Okay, the actual author of the first quote was Anna Salter from Predators, Pedophiles, and Rapists. And the second one in that paragraph before Mary Pride's was David Heckler, The Battle and the Backlash of Child Sexual Abuse. Okay, back to the book. Although we all need to be mindful of the possibility of false allegations, multiple studies have concluded that these instances are rare. R.K. Oates and D.P.H. Jones, 2000, Erroneous Concerns, Child Abuse and Neglect, page 149 to 157. When children do lie, it is usually done to protect the perpetrator, not in order to get anyone in trouble. And that references L. Dawson and M. Chafin in 1992 in their Journal of Interpersonal Violence, False Negatives in Sexual Abuse Interviews. Indeed, false allegations are not only a statistically remote possibility, but they are especially rare in comparison with the actual prevalence of child sexual abuse. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys, according to national studies, are sexually abused before the age of 18. This is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 2005. Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, Data and Statistics. Retrieved from January 2009. cdc.gov. Law enforcement and other professionals have made great strides in conducting abuse investigations over the past 25 years, improving their skills in interviewing victimized children and collecting evidence. This further reduces the risk of false allegations. Bold print. Accordingly, it is irresponsible for any pastor to automatically dismiss an abuse allegation, even against a respected member of their congregation. Mark 10, verses 13 to 16. The church is responsible for protecting the children in the church body, and this sacred stewardship is reinforced by Christ himself. Familiarity with the dynamics of abuse will prevent such a dangerous response. Heading: The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, or CSAAS. In order to understand the difficult, sensitive nature of how and when child sexual abuse is typically reported, consider how Dr. Roland Summit's work Not consider how, just consider his work, detailing child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. And his work was concluded in 1983. R.C. Summit, 1983. This study identified the dynamics present in child sexual abuse cases that constrain children from disclosing abuse early, if at all. These dynamics include secrecy, helplessness, entrapment, accommodation, delays, conflicting and unconvincing disclosures, and retraction. Let's look at each of those. First of all, we'll look at secrecy. 3 dynamics tend to impress secrecy on victims. First, the private nature of sexual abuse can suggest to the child their need to keep quiet. Secondly, fear of retaliation by the abuser or ostracism by the church community can impress secrecy on the victim. And thirdly, a promise of protection or special privileges given by the offender can keep a child quiet. Helplessness. Child sexual abuse victims typically feel helpless to stop the abuse for reasons of their powerlessness, their confusion, and the adult authority concepts. Their smaller size and their lack of maturity may render them feeling incapable of stopping the offense. Secondly, churches tend to teach children to obey those in positions of authority as though they are God. Perpetrators can be very good at exploiting this dynamic. They will use such teachings to admonish children to honor their requests to submit to sexual conduct. Thirdly, most sexual abuse is committed by trusted, even loved adult figures. Often offenders will threaten that they will no longer love the child if abuse is revealed. Entrapment and accommodation. Since the child victim has a secret he or she feels helpless to do anything about, Dr. Summit postulates they must often, quote, accept the situation and survive, unquote. A child may develop a coping mechanism such as convincing themselves that the sexual abuse prevents others from being victimized. Another survival strategy the child may use is disassociation during abusive episodes, subconsciously sending his or her mind to another place during the abuse in order to find, quote, a temporary emotional escape from the horror, fear, and pain. And that was stated by Herschel Walker, Breaking Free, My Life with Dissociative Identity Disorder. New York, Touchstone, 2009, page 16. Delayed and unconvincing disclosures. Due to the dynamics listed above, many children never disclose sexual abuse. When children do disclose an offense against them, the report is often delayed and comes out in an unconvincing manner due to years of stifled rage and trauma. Without awareness of child sexual abuse dynamics, a pastor may quickly dismiss the allegations without reporting the case to the authorities. Lastly, retraction. According to Summit, quote, in the chaotic aftermath of disclosure, the child discovers that the bedrock fears and threats underlying the secrecy are true. We find this on page 188 of Summit's report, The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. In other words, the perpetrators claim the child would be isolated or not believed or removed from the home or bullied at school or any number of other horrors does in fact often occur. Consequently, the child concludes that living with the lie is easier than telling the truth. So they recant their allegation. A number of studies on sexual abuse victims have found that recantation is not unusual. How Children Tell, The Process of Disclosure in Child Sexual Abuse by T. Sorensen and B. Snow in 1991. Child Welfare. Again, clergy and laity are unfamiliar with these dynamics, and they are not only at risk to accept a recantation at face value, but they're often used by perpetrators, the recantations are, to apply pressure on children in hope of securing such a recantation. The clergy are used by perpetrators to apply pressure. In more than one instance, for example, a non-offending caretaker has taken a child to a pastor to, quote, unquote, confess telling the lie. Church leaders would do well to take to heart the detrimental messages that they are sending to their weakest and most vulnerable members when they do not rise up and better defend the little ones among them. The ACE studies, the medical and mental health risks of child abuse. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE, is an ongoing collaborative research project of over 17,000 adult patients studying adverse childhood experiences including abuse, neglect, or witnessing domestic violence. It, quote, reveals staggering proof of the health, social, and economic risks that result from childhood trauma. That's from Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine, page 245 to 258. Adults who are suffering from one or more adverse childhood experience are statistically more likely to suffer from a variety of medical and mental health problems. The risk increases markedly based on the number or the severity of those experiences, adverse experiences. Without this knowledge, churches are at risk to dismiss an allegation of abuse, focusing primarily on the victim's behaviors, including any delinquent behaviors or criminal behaviors, without fully recognizing that the troubling conduct can actually be a consequence of abuse. In spiritual terms, the danger is that the church will be quick to offer judgment for visible sin without an appreciation of the need to provide a burdened victim with the enormous comfort of the gospel. Spiritual injuries resulting from sexual abuse. There are a number of studies documenting the impact of abuse on spirituality. For example, a study of 527 victims of child abuse found a significant, quote, spiritual injury, unquote, such as feelings of guilt, feelings of anger, feelings of grief, feelings of despair, feelings of doubt, fear of death, and a belief that God is unfair. This is from Child Abuse and Neglect by Ronald Lawson and others. This spiritual impact is even more pronounced when the perpetrator is a member of the clergy. Clergy abusers often use their religion to justify or excuse their sexual abuse of children in a manner that irreparably damages their understanding, the child's understanding of the Lord and of faith matters. Specifically, church attendance of such survivors diminishes. They are less likely to trust God, and their relationship with God often ceases to grow. Some researchers have found that a victim's spiritual coping behavior may play either a positive or negative role in the survivor's ability to cope with the abuse. Victims of severe abuse may remain, quote-unquote, stuck in their spiritual development, remaining angry with God. Children who are abused at younger ages are, quote, less likely to turn to God and others for spiritual support, unquote. Nonetheless, even victims describing a difficult relationship with God, quote, still rely on their spirituality for healing, unquote. Victims who experience, quote, greater resolution, unquote, are able to, quote, actively turn to their spirituality to cope, rather than attempting to cope on their own, unquote. This is from Terry Lynn Gall, spelled Gall, Spirituality and Coping with Life Stress Among Adult Survivors of CSA, Volume 30, copyright 2006. These findings underscore the tremendous importance of church bodies in responding properly to the victims within their congregations. If church leaders and members can provide a safe environment wherein a victim feels heard, accepted, and supported, it can restore the broken faith and tremendous spiritual injury the victim has suffered. The manner in which a congregation represents Jesus to the victim will be a linchpin in determining their future spiritual condition. And I'm going to take a break reading here. For some reason, it's just going very hard out loud today. But this is very meaningful material, so maybe small bites is good. Thank you for listening.